Hello and welcome to J&K Makes, and in this video we're going to be making a pen mandrel. Now I am going to be doing a little bit of talking in this video, and that's basically because I thought the footage itself wasn't very self-explanatory and it would probably be beneficial to just let you guys know what's happening along with the footage. So what I've done right now is I've got this piece of mild steel bar and I'm just threading each end M6, and the reason for that is that this is basically going to be the bit that fits inside the headstock and lets me drive the pen mandrel once it's been made. So this isn't actually a part that its only purpose is to basically drive the mandrel. And so the reason it's threaded both ends is the mandrel will have to screw into one end, and on the other end I'm going to use a drawbar system in the headstock, so that basically the piece of hexagonal steel bar that you'll see later on in the video can thread up the back of this and clamp this assembly inside the headstock, which is a really good way of doing it, because although right now what you see is me approximating a Morse taper number 1, I think a Morse taper number 1 is about 1.27 degrees or something, and especially on a metal lathe, that's almost impossible to accurately replicate. And even if it is, the turned finish is nowhere near the kind of hardening and grinding finish that normal Morse tapers have. So this will be close enough that when I put it in the spindle, it will actually bite, and it does bite, which is quite good. It will self-lock itself. But I don't quite trust it enough to be an official Morse taper, which is why I'm making the drawbar in the back end so it can pull it all together. And I'd recommend you do the same if you try and replicate this, because it's just a foolproof way. It's belt and braces effectively, and it also gives you a way to knock the Morse taper back out, because you just slightly slacken that drawbar and you can tap it, just like if you've ever had any experience on a Bridgeport milling machine. So I'm just finishing this part up right now. The last 2 inches is where the Morse taper runs out, and I don't want it any thinner, so I'm just turning that down to a nice straight diameter, and that'll be great. And I'm just doing a little bit of work up at the head because my Morse taper wasn't quite long enough, so I'm just extending that ever so slightly. The next part is going to be made out of hexagonal steel bar, and that's an absolutely great thing if you can get it, because as someone like me that doesn't have access to a milling machine, making anything that's not round is very difficult. And so if you can buy hexagonal steel or square steel, you can either use a 3-jaw chuck for the hexagonal stuff or a 4-jaw chuck for the square stuff. It just allows you to do so much more with your projects and make them so much more professional, even though you don't have the kind of 6,000, 10,000 pound milling machine. So this is the piece of hexagonal steel, and I'm just turning it down to about 10 millimeters, which is just purely an arbitrary dimension for clearance inside the spindle of the wood lathe, and it really is nothing more than that. I just need this to be able to reach in so it can grab the back of that Morse taper drive that I just made. And so now the next like 15 millimeters of the end I'll turn down to an M6, and basically I'll thread that, and there we go, that's our drawbar assembly pretty much finished. And so what is a pen mandrel? A pen mandrel is basically a very simple device. It is something in the headstock to drive a small shaft on which the whole pen assembly can be kind of clamped down to, so that you can actually turn that. And if that's a bit confusing, it will be visually explained later on in the video when we actually show you the final mandrel. But basically when you buy a pen kit, you get 2 big long brass bushes, and they are 6mm inside and they are 7mm outside diameters. And what you do is you take these bushes and you drill a hole in a piece of square wood blank, which is the wood blanks is what they call them. You drill a hole down the center of that, whatever your wood might be, and you glue these brass bushes in. And then what you do is you put this whole assembly on a mandrel, spaced out with little steel bushes, which you'll see me make later on in the video. And effectively you can line up the grain and you clamp it all together, and now you can turn your pen shape. And the rest of the pen parts, the nib, the back and all that stuff, just presses right into it. So it's a really wonderful and easy thing to make that creates a very satisfying final product. So it's very impressive actually, and you just saw fly past there on the screen, that was the finished headstock assembly. So now we're actually making this mandrel. And the mandrel is basically, as I was saying, it's just a long, smooth shaft, that's it. Just a long 6mm shaft that will have a thread at one end to screw into that Morse taper number 1, and it will have a center, which I drilled a few seconds ago, and you can see in the live center, that will be retained for the final mandrel, and that's so we can hold it between the kind of Morse taper number 1 in the headstock and the live center in the tailstock for support. And pen turning is just, it's really interesting, as you'll see at the end of this video. Even just the 5-minute test I did to prove this concept produced a really satisfying pen, and the materials are quite cheap. So I definitely recommend having a go, and especially if you can make your own mandrel, because that saves about £100 right off the bat, which is cracking. So what I'm making right now is, you just saw me part off the little bushes that I mentioned, and now we have the brass nut. And the reason I'm using brass is you could easily make one of these out of steel, but I don't want to make it out of steel because then it'll wear away my mandrel, and the mandrel was more complicated to turn, so if we make it out of brass, the little nut will wear out and it'll take a long time for it to wear out. But once it wears out, it's a simple enough job to just make another one. And so that's it, that is the mandrel finished. So you can see how that Morse taper number 1 goes up into the headstock, the bushes go along, your washer next, and then the brass nut. And it's all sandwiched together, and it's basically all just a friction drive on all of it. And it runs pretty true. I'm very happy with that, especially because I had to turn such a long bit. So I've put some tulip wood in here, and this is just an extremely rough test. This is not anything I'd try and sell or market. It's just to prove the concept and show you guys how a pen mandrel works. But it looks really good actually, and the final shapes are really organic in a way, and I like them a lot. So I'm definitely going to be trying to replicate this when I do the real pen blanks and things like that. And with all the bits loosely pressed into it, it looks pretty darn good. So I've got my lovely associate here, James, and he's going to write a little message. And what better to write than J&K Makes, a little bit of shameless self-promotion.